Picture this. It's the middle of a heated presidential election, and suddenly a tax conviction from decades ago becomes the main event. We're talking about a massive legal battle that's not just about taxes, but about character, the law, and who's even fit to lead the country. So let's break down exactly how the Supreme Court decided this one.
So this is the massive question the Philippine Supreme Court had to answer. Could something that happened way back then actually stop a presidential candidate in their tracks? The entire case, and I mean all of it, came down to one single legal concept. Was Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s conviction a crime of moral turpitude?
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the challenge that popped up during the election. Then, we're going to get into what moral turpitude actually means. After that, we'll see how it applies to tax crimes, walk through the Supreme Court's final decision, and then wrap up with why this case is such a big deal. Okay, so as the 2022 election campaign was really heating up, a bunch of different groups filed petitions with the Commission on Elections, the COMELEC, and their goal was pretty straightforward. They wanted to disqualify the frontrunner, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and they were basing their entire case on his 1995 conviction for not filing his income tax returns from 82 to 85.
Now, their argument wasn't just, hey, he was convicted of a crime. Nope. They were arguing it was a very specific kind of crime, one that involves moral turpitude. And why does that matter? Because under the law, that's one of the few things that can actually get a candidate kicked off the ballot. So suddenly this fancy legal phrase became the absolute center of the entire debate.
So what in the world is moral turpitude? It sounds really serious, and well, it is. The Supreme Court basically had to go back to square one to explain what it takes for a crime to go from being just a violation of the rules to an act that's, morally bankrupt.
And listen to the words the court uses here. This is not about a simple mistake. We're talking about an act of baseness, vileness, or depravity. It's about violating the fundamental duties that we all owe to each other as people and as a society. It's a really, really high bar.
And to give you a better idea, the court has a list of crimes it's already put in this category. You see the really serious stuff you'd expect, right? Smuggling, rape, forgery, fraud. But look at that last one, evasion of income tax. At first glance, you might think, aha, case closed. But as we're about to see, the exact phrasing here is everything.
And this, right here, is the absolute core of the legal argument, because the Supreme Court makes it super clear that not all tax crimes are the same. There's a huge difference between just not doing something and actively, purposefully trying to cheat the system. So let's break this down. On one side, you have failure to file an ITR. The court calls this an act of omission. You simply fail to do something you are legally required to do. The key here is that willful intent to deceive isn't a requirement to be found guilty. But on the other side, you have tax evasion. That's an act of fraud. It involves deliberate, intentional deception to avoid paying taxes. So the court says tax evasion definitely involves moral turpitude, but just failing to file? Not necessarily.
And this quote from Justice Garland's concurring opinion just nails it. He puts it so clearly. It all comes down to intent. Was it just neglect, an omission, or was there actual fraud, a willful plan to cheat the government? He says only if there's fraud does it rise to the level of moral turpitude.
Okay, so with that whole legal framework set up, the difference between omission and fraud, the Supreme Court then took that logic and applied it directly to the facts of Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s case from 1995. Let's see how it all played out. The court followed a really clear three-step path here. First, they looked at what he was actually convicted for. And the final verdict was for the lesser offense of failure to file an ITR, not for tax evasion. Second, they looked for the missing piece. In that final court decision, there was no proof and no finding of fraudulent intent. And third, they just stuck to their own precedent. They had already ruled in an earlier case, also involving Marcos Jr., that this specific offense, failure to file, doesn't automatically equal moral turpitude. And so the conclusion was pretty straightforward. Because the conviction was for a crime that the court had already decided did not involve moral turpitude, all of the petitions to have him disqualified were dismissed. He was cleared to run for president. So what's the big picture here? I mean, beyond just this one election, this case really sharpens a super important legal line for anyone who holds or wants to hold public office. At the end of the day, the biggest takeaway is this. The Supreme Court is saying that if you're going to disqualify someone based on moral turpitude, you need more than just proof they broke a rule. You need to prove that the act itself showed some kind of deep moral failing, like depravity or an intent to commit fraud. A simple failure to comply just isn't enough. And all of this leaves us with a really fundamental question to chew on. The court drew a very clear line based on the law and the evidence of fraud. But it makes you think about our leaders in a broader sense. Where do we, as citizens, draw that line for ourselves? What's the difference between a legal mistake and a true moral failure?